The woods of Appalachia do not welcome strangers. They watch them. The trees lean closer than they should, their roots twisting like fingers beneath the soil, and the wind carries whispers that never quite form words. Locals say the mountains remember everything, every footstep, every scream, every secret buried too shallow. That is why no one goes looking for the family who lived beyond the last broken road, where the fog never fully lifts and the birds refuse to sing. They were not listed on any census. No school records, no hospital files, no death certificates. Yet everyone knew of them. They were spoken about in lowered voices at gas stations and church basements, always followed by a pause, as if saying too much might invite something home. The family in the woods. The blood that went bad. The ones who never aged right. The first thing people noticed was the smell. Not decay exactly, but something sour, metallic, carried on warm air. Hunters complained their dogs refused to cross the tree line near the old ridge. Compasses spun uselessly. Even seasoned men felt suddenly watched, their skin prickling as though unseen eyes pressed against it from every direction. Some swore they heard crying deep in the forest, sometimes a baby, sometimes a grown man, sometimes something that sounded like both at once. They lived in a house built wrong. Too narrow. Too tall. Its windows were covered from the inside, yet candlelight sometimes flickered behind the boards, pulsing like a weak heartbeat. No one remembered the house being built, only that one day it was there, rotting into the landscape as if it had grown from the soil itself. The porch sagged under its own weight, and the door was always closed. Always. Those who claimed to have seen the family described the same unsettling details. Skin pale to the point of translucence, veins dark and swollen beneath it. Eyes too close together, staring without blinking. Limbs that bent strangely when they walked, like their bones had softened over time. They never spoke to outsiders. When they did open their mouths, it was only to breathe, shallow and wet, as though their lungs struggled to remember their purpose. Children were the worst part. Orphans of the mountains, people said, born into something already ruined. They played silently near the tree line, their movements stiff, their faces vacant. No laughter. No crying. Just watching. Always watching. If you waved, they didn't wave back. If you turned your back, you felt them closer than before. Doctors never examined them. Anyone who offered help was refused or simply vanished from the conversation entirely. The sheriff once tried to send deputies up the mountain. They returned hours later, pale and shaking, refusing to explain what they saw. One quit the force that same night. Another drank himself to death before winter. The oldest stories claim it started generations ago, an isolated marriage, then another, and another, until the blood turned inward, folding over itself like spoiled meat. But that explanation never satisfied those who felt the woods breathing around that place. Something else lived there too. Something that fed on secrecy, on isolation, on blood left to rot in darkness. The final warning came from a man who escaped. He stumbled out of the forest barefoot, clothes torn, eyes wide with terror that never left him. He said the family wasn't sick. They were preserved. Kept alive long past what nature allowed. He said the blood inside them didn't flow, it waited. Thick. Patient. Learning. He died 3 days later, veins blackening beneath his skin. The house still stands. The woods still whisper. And if you listen closely, late at night, when the fog rolls down the mountain and the world feels a little too quiet, you can hear something moving between the trees, slow, deliberate, searching for anyone foolish enough to wonder what happens when blood is left to rot, and the mountains decide to keep it. Most unsettling truth about the Appalachian family was not their appearance, their blood, or even their isolation, but the fact that they officially did not exist. Entire generations lived and died without a single record to confirm they had ever drawn breath. No birth certificates, no medical histories, no land deeds, no school enrollments. It was as if the mountains themselves had erased them from every system designed to keep track of human life. In rural America, where even the most remote families leave some trace behind, this absence felt deliberate, unnatural, and deeply wrong. Older residents claimed the family had always been there, long before paved roads cut through the hills and long before electricity reached the valleys. They remembered their grandparents whispering about the same house, the same bloodline, using the same cautious tone. Time moved forward for everyone else, but for that ridge deep in the woods, it seemed to circle endlessly, trapping the family inside a single, decaying moment. People aged, towns expanded, churches were rebuilt, yet the family remained unchanged in memory, like a stain that could not be scrubbed out. The land itself contributed to the mystery. The forest surrounding their home behaved differently. Hunters reported that trails shifted overnight. Familiar landmarks vanished. The air grew heavy, pressing against the chest, making even strong men feel weak and disoriented. Animals refused to cross certain boundaries, their instincts screaming warnings humans could not hear. Those who ignored the signs felt it immediately, a sensation of being studied, weighed, and quietly judged by something older than the trees. Attempts to involve authorities never went far. Officials would promise investigations, but paperwork vanished, phone calls went unanswered, and concern faded into uncomfortable silence. It was as though the moment someone tried to name the family on a form, reality itself pushed back. Some believed the isolation was intentional, a shield built from fear and denial, while others suspected something far worse, that the family's continued existence depended on remaining unseen, unacknowledged, and unmeasured by the outside world. This absence of records became the foundation of every rumor that followed. Without facts, imagination filled the gaps, twisting stories into something monstrous. People began to believe the family survived by slipping through cracks most humans never notice, feeding on secrecy, thriving where oversight failed. The idea that an entire bloodline could exist beyond documentation suggested a horrifying possibility, that they were not just forgotten by society, but actively claimed by the wilderness itself, absorbed into the mountains like roots sinking into wet soil, becoming part of something that did not want to be found, identified, or brought into the light. Solidified the family's horrifying reputation was the suffocating sense of fear that surrounded the ridge where they lived. Even before anyone saw the family, the woods themselves seemed alive with warning. Locals spoke of a heavy, metallic scent carried on the wind, something that made the stomach churn and the head spin, a smell that clung to clothing and skin long after leaving the forest behind. Hunters' dogs would whimper and refuse to move past certain tree lines, their instinct screaming that something unnatural lurked ahead. Compasses would spin erratically, and the sun, when it shone through the canopy, appeared muted and distorted, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than physics should allow. It was as though the forest had been designed to repel anyone who sought the truth, a living barrier protecting secrets far older and darker than any local rumor. Those who ventured near reported more than physical discomfort, an invisible weight pressed against them, as if unseen eyes followed every movement. Even seasoned outdoorsmen, hardened by years of navigating the mountains, described an almost tangible awareness watching them from every direction. Every crackle of leaves underfoot, every gust of wind through the branches, became a potential threat, amplifying the sense that trespassers were intruding on something deeply wrong. Some heard soft cries in the distance, human yet twisted, shifting from infantile whimpers to the strained wails of an adult, sometimes overlapping as if a single voice contained multiple lives. The sounds were fleeting, vanishing when approached, leaving behind only the echo of unease that settled in the chest like a stone. The intensity of the forest's hostility created a natural barrier between the world and the family, reinforcing their isolation and mystique. Townspeople learned to respect the invisible line, their curiosity tempered by instinct and experience. Attempts to approach the ridge were few, and those who did returned pale and shaken, often unable to explain what they saw. Some reported glimpses of movement, figures bending in ways human bodies should not, flashes of pale skin glimpsed through the trees, shapes that disappeared when focused upon directly. Others spoke of sudden dizziness or nausea, as though the very air drained their strength and willpower. The forest seemed to operate on its own rules, enforcing boundaries that ordinary laws of man could not penetrate, shaping the perception of the family into something almost mythic. Over time, the tales of fear became as concrete as the family itself. It was understood that the ridge was more than just land, it was a threshold between reality and something corrupted, a warning system built by time and darkness. The metallic scent, the shifting trails, the strange cries, and the oppressive presence all coalesced to form a tangible barrier that few dared cross. The family's existence was not merely a matter of secrecy, it was safeguarded by the very environment, turning fear itself into a weapon, shaping the perception of anyone who dared even think of entering that cursed corner of Appalachia. Cemented the family's terrifying legend was the house itself, a structure that seemed alive with decay and defiance, existing in ways that contradicted logic and human memory. Those who caught glimpses of it described a building that was impossibly narrow yet unnaturally tall, as if the walls had been stretched skyward while the foundation remained rooted in some cursed soil. Its windows were boarded from the inside, yet at night, a faint candlelight flickered behind them, pulsing rhythmically like a weak heartbeat struggling to survive. The house had no history in town records, no builder, no permit, no account of construction. It appeared in the collective memory as though it had grown from the earth itself, a grotesque outgrowth of the forest, slowly rotting in place while remaining eerily intact. Even when storms lashed the mountains, knocking trees down and tearing apart outbuildings, the house stood, sagging and twisted but never truly harmed, as if protected by forces beyond reason. The porch sagged under its own weight, creaking under invisible pressure, and the door remained closed at all hours, uninviting yet impossibly heavy with an air of command. Locals who approached described a sensation of being watched, the hair on their necks prickling despite the absence of movement. Some claimed to hear faint scraping sounds from within, as if something moved behind the walls, deliberate and cautious, aware of every step taken by outsiders. It was not just a home, it was a sentinel, a container for secrets that had festered over generations. The house seemed to absorb light and sound, creating pockets of shadow so dense that even in daylight, one could feel a chill pass through the air, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The very shape of the building unnerved the senses. Angles were wrong, lines of the roof and walls mismatched, yet the structure remained stable. Shadows shifted unnaturally around it, elongating or bending in ways that defied geometry. The house's presence suggested patience and intention, as though it were waiting for something or someone to step inside so it could continue its slow, insidious work. Townsfolk told stories of those who ventured too close and returned shaken, speaking in hushed tones of fleeting glimpses, a figure at the window, a shadow moving across the boards, or the faint sound of breathing where no one could possibly exist. The house was more than an inanimate object, it was the stage upon which the family's grotesque life unfolded, shaping their isolation and amplifying the fear surrounding them. It reinforced the notion that this was a place outside ordinary experience, a domain where normal rules did not apply, and where any intrusion carried a silent, escalating risk. Its decay was a mask, and its strange vitality was proof that the corruption inside did not belong to the living alone, but had seeped into wood, stone, and soil, creating a home as horrifying and unnatural as the bloodline it sheltered. Deepened the horror surrounding the Appalachian family was the grotesque and unnatural appearance of its members. Those who claimed to have seen them spoke in whispers, careful to avoid drawing attention to themselves, as though merely naming the family aloud might summon the very evil they described. The people who lived in the house were pale almost to the point of translucence, their skin stretched tightly over veins swollen and darkened, as though their blood had thickened and congealed beneath the surface. Eyes were set too close together, giving their gaze a penetrating, almost hypnotic quality, and when they stared, it felt like they were reading the deepest, most secret thoughts of anyone unfortunate enough to meet their gaze. Limbs moved in subtle but disturbing ways, bending and twisting at angles that human bones should not allow, their motions deliberate yet oddly fluid, as though the family's bodies had long ago abandoned the constraints of ordinary anatomy. Strangers rarely encountered the family directly. Most of the information came from glimpses through windows, brief sightings in the fog, or descriptions from those who had been foolish enough to approach the house. Children were particularly unsettling, their movements stiff and unnatural, their faces empty of expression, devoid of the normal warmth or curiosity one expects from youth. They did not laugh, cry, or play in the way other children did. Instead, they watched with an eerie patience, always observing, never participating, their heads tilting in unison as if some unspoken signal directed their attention. Locals claimed that if one turned their back, the children seemed to inch closer, appearing in places where they could not possibly have moved so quickly, vanishing just as suddenly when confronted directly. The adults of the family were no less disturbing. Their speech was minimal, limited to shallow, wet breaths or soft, guttural noises that resembled exhalation more than language. Their faces were expressionless, yet somehow, when they moved their lips, it conveyed a predatory awareness, a sense of calculation that made outsiders instinctively recoil. Every detail, the long, spindly fingers, the strangely angled shoulders, the pallor that seemed to glow faintly in dim light, hinted at generations of isolation, of bloodline corruption, and of a life lived apart from ordinary human contact. Even the animals surrounding the house behaved unnaturally. Dogs cowered, birds avoided the area, and other wildlife seemed to skirt the perimeter with a deliberate caution, reinforcing the sense that the family's presence warped the very world around them. Sightings, no matter how fleeting, created lasting trauma. Witnesses described a lingering dread, a sensation that the family's gaze followed them long after leaving the ridge. The way they looked, the way they moved, and the oppressive atmosphere surrounding them convinced anyone who saw them that these were not ordinary people, but a lineage twisted and preserved by something far darker than mere isolation or poverty. The unnaturalness of their bodies became proof of a deeper corruption, a tangible sign that the rot within their blood was not metaphorical but manifested in flesh and bone, making them objects of both fear and morbid fascination. Added to the terror surrounding the Appalachian family was the chilling behavior of the children, whose presence alone seemed to unsettle the very air around the ridge. Unlike normal children, they did not play, laugh, or cry. Their movements were mechanical, stiff, and deliberate, as if each step was calculated, yet somehow fluid in a way that defied ordinary human motion. Those who glimpsed them described empty, vacant faces, pale and drawn, their eyes unnervingly still yet always observing, following every movement with a patience that no child should possess. They did not interact with outsiders in any meaningful way. If approached, they would simply stop and watch, tilting their heads slightly, as if considering whether the observer was a threat, an intruder, or simply part of some experiment that had been ongoing for generations. The silence that surrounded them amplified the unnatural quality of their presence, and the stillness of their observation often made adults feel as though the children were measuring not only their bodies but the very essence of their being. The children were most disturbing because their presence seemed to warp perception. Locals reported that distances felt wrong near them, as if the forest itself bent around their movements. Hunters' dogs refused to enter areas where the children lingered, snarling at nothing or running away entirely, while birds and other wildlife seemed to vanish, leaving the ridge unnaturally quiet. Occasionally, faint, unsettling sounds, whimpers, breaths, or noises that resembled a mix between laughter and sobbing would drift through the trees, always just out of reach, creating a sense that the children were not entirely human or perhaps were accompanied by something else entirely. Their behavior was often described as hypnotic. Even the bravest adults admitted feeling drawn toward them despite a deep, instinctive warning that to do so was dangerous. Witnesses also noted the uncanny coordination among the children. They often moved in small groups, their steps synchronized in a way that no ordinary sibling or peer group would naturally adopt. When one child tilted their head, others followed almost immediately, giving the impression of an unseen connection or shared consciousness. Even fleeting eye contact with a single child could trigger a creeping sense of dread, a gnawing unease that lingered long after leaving the ridge. Stories told in hushed tones spoke of children appearing in places they could not have reached in the moments before, vanishing and reappearing as though the forest itself had swallowed them and spat them out elsewhere. These children were not merely isolated or neglected, they were otherworldly, embodiments of the family's corruption and the rot that ran through generations. Their silent observation and unnatural presence created an invisible barrier, warning outsiders to stay away and hinting that anyone who disregarded it might become part of the story themselves, trapped forever in the quiet, unblinking gaze of a lineage born to haunt the forest. Entrenched the family's horror in local lore was the terrifying way they communicated, or, more accurately, how they refused to communicate. Words, in the conventional sense, were foreign to them. Speech was rare, broken, and guttural, reduced to wet, labored breaths or low, throaty murmurs that carried an undertone of menace. Even when they did attempt sound, it was not language as outsiders understood it. The noises were more ritualistic, echoing through the house and woods like the sighs of something ancient and patient. Those who dared to listen closely often reported an instinctive revulsion, as if the vibrations themselves were poisonous to comprehension, carrying with them the weight of generations of decay and secrecy. The absence of normal speech was more than unsettling, it created an environment in which imagination filled in the gaps, and that imagination rarely drew kindly pictures. Their silence amplified the sense of being constantly observed. Witnesses spoke of the oppressive feeling of the family's eyes following them, noting that even when no one appeared to be physically present, the weight of attention was palpable. The quiet was not peaceful, it was predatory. It suggested calculation, a measured awareness of every movement and every thought of anyone who trespassed near their domain. The family's restraint seemed intentional, a form of psychological dominance designed to unnerve, disorient, and ultimately control anyone who dared approach. The air around the house became heavy, as though each silent moment stretched and pressed against the ribs, constricting the chest and tightening the throat. Outsiders often left with the haunting impression that they had been part of a silent dialogue, one conducted entirely in subtle gestures, unblinking stares, and the cadence of deliberate breath. Even when they interacted among themselves, the family's communication remained bizarre and alien. Movements were synchronized, expressions muted, and occasional murmurs seemed to carry a hidden rhythm, almost musical in nature yet profoundly wrong in tone. There were stories of children tilting their heads simultaneously, adults adjusting their stance in exact unison, and fleeting noises that sounded like speech but dissolved into incomprehensibility. Outsiders interpreted this as evidence of a shared consciousness or an internal logic that had evolved apart from humanity, a system of interaction designed for and by the corrupted bloodline. The lack of verbal communication also made the family nearly impossible to document or study. No one could glean information from conversation. Any attempt at questioning or reasoning ended in frustration, confusion, or the creeping terror of realizing that comprehension itself was futile. The absence of dialogue reinforced the mystery, magnifying fear and rumor, and turning every encounter into a confrontation with something fundamentally unknowable. By refusing to speak, the family ensured that the stories about them would grow unchecked, shaped by imagination, conjecture, and the darkest instincts of those who lived nearby, and that the sense of dread surrounding the house would remain as complete, as suffocating, and as unyielding as the mountains themselves. Intensified the family's sinister reputation was the overwhelming and unnatural hostility of the forest surrounding their home. The woods themselves acted as a barrier, an extension of the family's isolation, shaping the perception of anyone who dared enter or even linger near the ridge. Trails shifted overnight, landmarks disappeared, and paths that had been familiar for decades seemed to twist into mazes with no logical pattern. Hunters and hikers reported sudden disorientation, compasses spinning wildly and GPS devices failing, as if the terrain itself rejected intrusion. Even the air carried a palpable weight, pressing down on the chest, making breathing difficult and creating a nausea that left visitors vulnerable and disoriented. This environmental hostility was not subtle, it was deliberate, calculated, and seemingly alive, reinforcing the sense that the forest protected the family in ways that ordinary law, logic, or human interference could never overcome. Animals, too, seemed attuned to the unnaturalness of the ridge. Dogs refused to pass certain tree lines, growling or fleeing with fear that their owners could not interpret. Birds avoided the area entirely, leaving it eerily silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves that sounded almost like whispered warnings. Even deer and other wild animals skirted the periphery, as if instinctively understanding that some invisible boundary marked the forest as off-limits. The absence of normal wildlife amplified the isolation, creating a vacuum of sound and life that heightened the tension and gave the impression that the forest itself was aware of intruders. It was a place where human perception became unreliable, where familiar rules of movement, direction, and causality no longer applied. The hostile environment also seemed to manipulate time and memory. Visitors reported glimpses of movement at impossible distances, fleeting shadows that appeared closer than they should have been, and sounds that echoed unnaturally, seeming to originate from multiple points at once. The longer someone remained, the more distorted their sense of direction became, as though the forest had a will of its own, bending space to keep the family hidden. Locals described the ridge as cursed or watched, believing that the very act of approaching it invoked a silent awareness that could sense fear, curiosity, or defiance. Even seasoned outdoorsmen felt their confidence erode quickly, replaced by a creeping dread that something unseen was tracking them, measuring their intentions, and judging their worthiness to exist beyond the tree line. This hostility was not passive, it actively protected the family. It amplified the myths surrounding them, turning rumors into unquestionable truths, and ensured that few people dared approach closely enough to learn anything for certain. The forest was a guardian and a predator, a physical manifestation of the corruption within the family itself, and it created an ever-present, inescapable tension that lingered long after one had left the ridge, leaving an indelible mark on anyone who dared to trespass near the place where the blood that had rotted inside generations of the Appalachian family continued to pulse, patient and vigilant. Explain key point number 9 into 450 words, without any subheadings or ending sentence. Explain key point number 9 into 450 words, without any subheadings or ending sentence. Cemented the family's reputation as one of the most horrifying in America was the idea that their corruption was not merely physical but generational, a slow, insidious rot passed down through the bloodline like a disease no doctor could diagnose or cure. The earliest stories claimed that the family had become isolated decades, perhaps centuries ago, through a series of intermarriages and deliberate seclusion that cut them off entirely from the outside world. Each generation compounded the deformity of the last, not just in appearance but in temperament, instinct, and even the strange, predatory awareness that seemed to permeate every member. Locals whispered that their longevity was unnatural, that the elders who should have died long ago remained alive, preserved by some combination of secrecy, isolation, and the very darkness that clung to the forest. Their bodies moved with a rigidity and fluidity that seemed impossible, and even children bore the marks of a corruption that no ordinary childhood could produce. The rot within the family was not limited to physical abnormalities. Those who glimpsed them noted an intelligence that was cruel, patient, and calculating, as though they had evolved an acute understanding of human fear and the ways it could be manipulated. Outsiders could not reason with them, communicate with them, or appeal to ordinary social norms because the family operated according to rules entirely their own, passed down silently from parent to child, whispered through gesture, gaze, and breath. Their blood was described as thick, almost stagnant, carrying with it a weight that seeped into the house, the soil, and even the perception of anyone who dared to trespass. It was not merely that they were hidden or isolated, they were preserved, maintained through generations by the very corruption that had twisted their bodies and minds, a living testament to a cycle that fed on secrecy and decay. The generational corruption also explained why attempts to intervene always failed. Doctors, law enforcement, and curious strangers who approached the ridge with intent to help or investigate found themselves physically and mentally unprepared for the reality of the family. Those who tried to record, measure, or study the household often returned traumatized, sick, or dead, and no tangible evidence ever followed them. The lineage seemed to guard itself, ensuring that every generation preserved both the secrecy and the horror that defined them. Children born into the family already carried the burden of the past, shaped by the patterns of deformity, silence, and predatory awareness that had been perfected over decades. This cycle of corruption created a sense of inevitability, a terrifying logic that nothing outside the ridge could stop. The family's influence extended beyond the visible, beyond memory, and into the very air, soil, and perception surrounding their domain. Every element, the forest, the house, the unnatural behavior, and the generational bloodline, combined into a single, cohesive horror. A family preserved by rot, perfected by isolation, and sustained by a patience that outlasted ordinary human comprehension. Anyone who encountered even a fragment of it left changed, carrying with them the knowledge that some lineages are too corrupted, too patient, and too self-sustaining to ever truly die.